option? Help us get the real bad guys. What else can you tell us? Anything helps.
I'm sorry. I have nothing.
Same, sugar.
X-Men 97 Episode 7, and Rogue is on a full-out rampage.
You gonna be needing this.
Now, why'd you have to go and do that, nah? Salutations and fist bumps, folks. Welcome back to the grid. As per usual, with this series, we have zero time to waste, so let's ride. As the recap opens, we hear the voice of Rogue.
Previously on X-Men.
The two lovebirds still ain't talking.
Which, again, gives us context clues about who this episode is really about. And it uncovers what I mentioned in a previous breakdown about Rogue having a really mean streak, especially when she's angry.
Prepare to meet Mr. Angry Eyes.
And the recap also shows the depth of what Scott is most likely feeling after the events of Genosha and specifically losing Madeline. This also calls back to the first episode where it was believed that all Sentinels had been destroyed in the destroying of the previous Master Mold, which originally happened in the original animated series. But since that happened, this now tips me off to the fact that Trask most likely had a benefactor the entire time, and it looked to be Sinister per episode 6. Or is it? But this also calls back to the conversation that Trask and Scott had in the desert at the end of that battle when he says,
"You've no idea how it feels to be left behind by the future."
Which is a bit of foreshadowing about what is going to happen later in the episode. Then, as the credits open, we again hear the subtle, somber moments of the theme song, which again happened after episode 5, but never before. And my guess as to why that is still happening is because the X-Men are still trying to deal with the aftermath of episode 5, which seems like that is something that they're going to have to deal with over and over and over again forever. So could this actually be a staple inside of the theme from now on? After the credits, though, we unfortunately place Gambit to rest, which coincides with what Charles saw on his dystopian astroplane, which now that we have this image, it was pretty clear to see that Magneto is more than likely not dead. But the question that I had until later was, where is he now? But this episode's title of Bright Eyes is strategically placed right in front of the memorial wreath for Gambit, which subtly tells a larger story about how Rogue is feeling, because she's now filled with rage as red as Remy's eyes. But it's also the same thing that she calls Cable, which becomes really paramount, or at least he does, later on. During the funeral, we get a brief glimpse or a brief cameo of members of the Thieves Guild, which also includes Remy's brother, Bobby. Oh, and by the way, if you didn't know this, there are 2 extra branches, so in total 3 branches of the Thieves Guild. So there's obviously the New Orleans branch, then there's the Tokyo branch, and New York. And the New Orleans branch was actually first seen in Gambit #1. We are also reminded that Nightcrawler is a minister and used to be a monk before joining the X-Men. And if you don't remember, the X-Men actually originally meet him while he's inside of a monastery. At least that's what happens inside of the original animated series. He also then quotes what most would consider to be the nickname of Gambit, Wildcard, when he says, "Life, like the cards, is wild." But we also hear him compliment his fallen friend when he says that he was so blind to his own potential, which, if you're a fan of Gambit, you probably would say the same thing, because he was always selling himself short, even though he's one of the stronger and unique members of the X-Men. And also he would do that because he felt like, because of the way that he was born into a life of bayou crime, that he didn't measure up to everyone else a part of the group, hence the affiliation with the Thieves Guild. And that fact becomes a little bit more ironic as the camera pans to his brother. As Nightcrawler ends his eulogy, he says that every gambler has their tell, and Gambit's was modesty. And now, though I'm not a betting man per se, I have watched a lot of world poker tournaments on ESPN. So take that for what it's worth. But to speak to that fact specifically, it is very true. And it also reminds me of lyrics from The Gambler by Kenny Rogers, where he mentions that a man made his living by watching people's faces, while at the same time he gives him some advice saying,
"You got to know when to hold 'em, know when to fold 'em, know when to walk away, know when to run.
You never count your money." Sorry, I couldn't help it. The song is catchy, okay? But as the funeral ends, Jubilee experiences the range of emotions that happen through grief, questioning why things are the way they are, why are certain people not present, confusion, anger, and a bit of helplessness. And when Logan mentioned that grief is a lonely war, man, I felt that line wholeheartedly, because as someone that has dealt with that battle recently, that moment felt all too real, because it really is. But Nightcrawler explains that what Jubilee is worried about is very valid, because what Rogue is feeling is not just usual grief. She's angry. And when I say angry, I mean furious, because not only is she dealing with a lot of dormant anger and feelings that have been pent up for a long time regarding Remy, she's most likely also feeling a bit of regret because of what happened inside of the events right before the attack on Genosha. In specific terms, I'm talking about her dancing and kissing Eric in front of him, which we don't have to wait very long to see, because we see it all over the face of Rogue as she flies into a military base. And though I've never personally flown into a military base myself, I have done it on GTA 5 and other things like that. And I can tell you that it is not a safe place to do that or anywhere else. But like I said, you just can't walk up in there, fam. You just can't do that. But go off, Rogue. Go off. And not only does she walk into the front door like she owns the place, she gives the officers on the front line the Donkey Kong treatment with zero hesitation, fam. Then after she does that, she goes ham sandwich on all of them boys, tossing literal tanks like they're Tonka toys, which then leads to a cameo from Thunderbolt Ross. Excuse me, General Thunderbolt Ross, who is voiced by Michael Patrick McGill. But the original tone, or the starting tone, started or sounded like William Hurt. But in his statement, he mentions that the facility that they are currently standing in was built to house the Hulk. So he doesn't feel like, or seem to be worried at all, that a X-Men from the swamps, as he says, is knocking on their front door. But he really should be. But the facility that he's talking about was loosely depicted inside of the Hulk, or specifically inside of the Incredible Hulk. And my fingers are crossed about possibly, hopefully, maybe getting World War Hulk in the near future. But we'll just have to see if that actually happened. But like I said, he mentions that the mutant that is knocking on their front door is an unhinged mutant from the swamp, which, if you don't know, is coming or talking about the fact that she hails from Caldecott County, Mississippi, which is fictional, but it comes or is taken from the western part of Mississippi, and specifically the western Mississippi or Mississippi Delta, which is swampland. And he's saying all of this from his standpoint that mutants, especially the one that is currently outside, is not as powerful as the Hulk. But that is short-lived. Scott is then seen talking to President Robert Kelly, which, humor me for a second, does kind of sound like Wizard Kelly, y'all.
Never correct wizard's English. Oh, and by the way, you fired.
Okay, I'm sorry. Back to everything else. But Robert Kelly first appears in comics in X-Men 133 and dies in X-Men Volume 2, 108. But also in the glasses of Scott, you can see that he is watching two different news outlets, Channel 6 and Channel 11, that are both talking about the massacre in Genosha. And during their conversation, Scott mentions Val Cooper, which further adds more fuel to the fire that she most likely is Mystique, because Robert Kelly is also the person that outed Blue Marvel in the comics. So maybe he knows. And yet again, another politician worried about optics.
Unfortunate optics.
Optics, sir?
Now, this is probably something very small to some, but it was pretty huge to me when I saw it. But the hologram that displays President Kelly looks very similar to the Mamba symbol, which, if it is, that's a really cool tribute to Kobe Bean Bryant. Then, as Jean enters the room, we see her in her fight suit for the first time outside of the credits, though this time she has her hair down. They then end their conversation mentioning the professor, who unbeknownst to them is alive and probably headed their way as soon as the writers could write it. Then as the team lands in Genosha, you hear Beast quote Mr. Rogers.
Look for the helpers. You will always find people who are helping. The ever affable Mr. Rogers.
Which actually comes from a quote that Mr. Rogers' mother used to tell him after he would see things that were frightening on the TV. Then as the rescue cleanup starts, the number 12 is seen on the tent, which comes up inside of the MCU a few times, specifically between two other mutants, one of which we see later in this episode, which are none other than Wanda and Pietro in Age of Ultron.
You understand?
You know, I'm 12 minutes older than you.
But it also happens between Pepper and Tony.
Is your baby. Give yourself 12% credit.
12%.
An argument can be made for 15.
In the Avengers, and between Peter Quill and Rocket in Guardians of the Galaxy.
What percentage?
I don't know. 12%.
12%?
That's a fake laugh.
Which itself is more of a running joke inside of the MCU, which came from Josh Whedon. Then old Patricia shows back up, which further adds to layers between their relationship, specifically talking about Beast and Patricia, when he realizes later that the tolerance seems to be running out, or that everything that has been going on between the two of them feels like a bit of tolerance and not affection. Then as Rogue lands, we see a motorcycle which has a license plate on it, AVN-A10, which is actually a callback to the first appearance of Steve Rogers in comics, which is inside Avengers Annual number 10 from 1967. And the voice of Cap is none other than Josh Keaton, who also voiced him in What If. We can also then see Cap open a secret door using a radio, which seems slightly ironic to me because that is how he was introduced to the MCU after coming out of the ice. But then as the conversation between Cap and Rogue about going into Mexico City goes south, Rogue decides to throw Cap's shield like a frisbee.
You gon' be needing this.
Now, was that really called for? Probably not, but it was hilarious. Then Jubes and Roberto have a heart-to-heart about him telling his mother that he's a mutant, which, as we find out later, she already knew, which makes sense because I don't know how, but most mothers know everything about their children, even when they don't even tell them about it. Later, we get another quote from Beast, but this time it's from Martin Luther King.
Riots are the language of the unheard.
Martin Luther King.
Which this quote comes from a speech he gave in 1968 at Grosse Pointe High School. Then Rogue makes very quick work of the GTA armed guards, then making her way into the compound resort that Gyrick is actually staying inside of. And then Rogue literally tells him, bruh, this ain't that. And as she probes his mind, she then sees Bastion, who is the mastermind between Operation Zero Tolerance, aka OZT. Now, Operation Zero Tolerance was an event that transpired shortly after the Onslaught saga inside of the comics. It then became the primary focus of most mutant-centric stories, specifically those bearing the X in their title, which happened throughout the summer of 1997, which fits this very well in terms of why they would choose this story to build around. But Bastion, which is short for Sebastian Gilberti, is a mutant-hating machine who emerged from the chaos of battle, and he is technically a fusion of Nimrod and Master Mode, which makes sense as to why we've seen that in the beginning of episodes lately, per the credits. As Scott and Jean hit the Citadel, we see the rats that were present inside of Jean/Madeline's vision on the astral plane. And she now explains the feeling that she has at this point experienced 3 times. She further explains the relationship, or the tattered relationship, that has now become of what Scott and her have after she has left the X-Men 3 different times as well, because she mentions the shuttle crash, then when she sacrificed herself to the sun, and inside of the Dark Phoenix series. Then she feels a telepath. Scott really wants that to be Madeline, but it turns out to be Emma Frost, who actually shows up in her diamond form for the first time in this series. And it actually happened exactly the same way, or very similar to the same thing that we saw on screen in the comics. Because like in this situation, she is the lone survivor after the massacre in Genosha, which shows up in New X-Men 115. And then when they take her out or rescue her, she gives a nod to the saying that diamonds, or pressure, creates diamonds, when she says,
"I've always done well under pressure."
Then after Jubes and Roberto speak with his mom, Nightcrawler finds Rogue, and he calls her sister, which she makes mention of later, but this is very fitting because she is his adopted sister, which again shines a little more light on the fact that Mystique is somewhere, and I really do believe that Val Cooper is the somewhere. But if you don't know, the story behind why she is his adoptive sister is because Mystique takes in Rogue after she decides to run away. Then after Bastion takes out Gyrick, the crew flies to Madripoor, which, by the way, is also seen in Falcon and the Winter Soldier, which makes Cap's appearance inside of this episode way more fitting. But last time that we went to Madripoor in the MCU, we were dancing. As the crew lands inside of Madripoor, we see VistaCorp and the 99-cent coffee yet again. And also next to those, a Yoshida sign, which feels like a nod to both Toshiba and Samsung in the way that the logo is created and in terms of how it sounds. We later see a guard wearing the Horizon symbol on a hat, which means that we are currently inside of Horizon Labs, the leading company that creates the most advanced technology in the Marvel Universe. And this is first seen in comics inside of The Amazing Spider-Man number 648 that comes inside of 2010. And yo, Morph is definitely the annoying little brother, because him drinking that diet pop is loud and is extremely annoying. And if I was in the elevator, I would have been driven up a wall. But as they pass the cases that show the things that Bastion has been cooking up, which is actually the creation of Prime Sentinels, which we see later on after Rogue Mufasa's Trask. But Logan then mentions his spy days, which, if you didn't know, happened in the comics back in the 90s, where a pre-adamantium Logan meets Carol Danvers. But then we get a direct origin for this series in terms of OZT given by Trask, which the origin, or the description of the origin, is very similar to what happens in the comics.
Tell us what OZT stands for.
Some group that rose from the ashes of my old Sentinel program. While you X-Men have been holding hands with mankind, they've been placing dominoes.
But the line right before she Mufasas him, when she says, or after he says, I have nothing, and she says, same sugar, is some of the best writing that I've seen inside of the MCU to date. And I've been saying that a lot about this series, but it's really, really good because the underlying tone of that one phrase is that she has nothing to lose and gain all at the same time. So doing this literally means nothing to her. So the fact that she lets him go doesn't mean that she's going to get any answers, but she's also not going to lose anything as well because she's already lost so much. Now, as she does this, notice who she's talking about in terms of her man that she mentions in her rant. It is not Eric. She's specifically talking about Remy, which also stood out to me as a slight clue that Magneto is not dead because of the context clues that are mentioned or not mentioned here. Then as Trask transforms into Prime Sentinel Trask and puts down Rogue with one hit, Beast Mode Scott shows back up. And like I mentioned earlier, a transformation from Morph shows Quicksilver heading towards Trask and then getting smacked in the face. But we also get a brief Dragon Ball Z moment or nod when Trask and Jean meet in the air. And remember that conversation that was mentioned inside of the recap? That shows back up when Trask says,
"Do you remember what my inferior form asked you in the Sahara? Tell me, orphan, how does it feel to be abandoned by the future?"
Which is a juxtaposition of what he felt before in his inferior form and what he feels now as Prime Sentinel. And it also suggests that the X-Men currently constructed are very obsolete at this point. But after each one of them goes at Trask one after the other, they cannot take him down until Cable shows up. And ironically, that happens when he's coming to save his dad. But when Cable does show up on the scene, you can now see that none of them, including Scott, until Jean has her telepathic moment with Cable, none of them knew who he was to them. Or more specifically, Scott had no idea who he was to him until the dots were connected recently after Madeline and Scott had their conversation about his eyes. Then after Cable explains what is going to happen in the future if they don't take care of the person that is responsible for all of this, who is Bastion, by the way, we see him and Sinister debriefing. And we also hear that Bastion gained a lot of tactical data from the battle that just happened, which again feels like a Dragon Ball Z nod because of the way that Saiyans usually gain access to more information on how to level up or get stronger after each battle. But it also shines a light that Bastion is using some sort of machine learning technology that he is now feeding back into all of the tech that he is currently building, which feels a little bit modern in terms of what would have been available in the 90s. But again, we are talking about fictional stories here because even at this point in 2024, we don't really have self-driving cars and all that kind of stuff everywhere, but machine learning does learn a bit about the world over and over and over again through trial and error. So yes, that possibly is where they got that from. But he also says that the villains of old have been trying to take out the X-Men since '92, which is the debut of the animated series. But Bastion then uncovers that he has been watching everything that the X-Men have been doing, even the stuff in space. And he says that this has happened since he evolved. But this is where Sinister learns that Charles is not dead, which then leads to the unveiling of Eric still being alive. Now, Sebastian's love for the song Flying Purple People Eater seems very fitting here, ironically, but very fitting, which seems like a slight nod to the fact that when Prime Sentinels become Prime Sentinels, or at least that's what we've depicted here, they turn purple, which happens after they are resurrected in their new Sentinel form. And it also seems like a nod to the fact that he himself is decked out in purple. But the Prime Protocol only shows up or is activated after the person that it has been implanted inside of is taken over or eaten by it. Whew. Okay, everybody still with me? We have a whole lot of stuff that has happened inside of this series at this point. I mean, man, Eric is still alive. There's so much that is going to happen inside of this series, and I can't wait. I'm really going back inside of all the X-Men comics that I've wanted to go back inside of for a long time, and it has been an absolute joy to do so. But if you are now on the same nostalgic train that I am on, go ahead and hit this playlist right up here. And if you want to go all the way through everything that has happened inside of the X-Men series or X-Men 97 series from the start to now, hit this playlist right up here. And until next time, y'all be smooth, blurred out.